Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And thank you for joining us for today's webinar. And apologies for the slightly late start. We had a few technical issues, as is the way with Zoom, but it looks like we're underway now, so all's good there. My name's Henry Pearson. I work here in the OECD Directorate for Education and Skills. And we're here today to talk about what is now a quite well-known phenomenon, which is cyberbullying. We're going to look at its effects, where and how it's likely to happen, and what schools and governments can do about it. I don't think I need to take too much time to explain what we mean by cyberbullying, although we will discuss the exact definition later on. But I think it's right to say that in a digitally saturated world, most people now understand the issue and the problems it can cause. And I think it's precisely because our world is so digitally saturated that these issues need to be addressed. Because of course, you know, as the digital world expands into more and more corners of our lives, so too will the opportunities or risks of cyberbullying. So to discuss this, I'm very pleased to be joined by a wonderful panel of very, very smart people. We have Andreas Schleicher, the OECD Director for Education and Skills. We have Samir Hinduja, Co-Director of the Cyberbullying Research Center in the United States. Lucy Bowes, Professor of Developmental Psychopathology at the University of Oxford, and Francesca Gottschalk, who is a policy analyst here in the OECD Center for Educational Research and Innovation. So how it's going to work is Andreas is first going to present a recent paper on cyberbullying that we published here at the OECD. And then we will chat to our panel for a while. And then after that, we'll have some time for questions from the audience. So if you do have a question, please, I ask you to put it in the chat, or if you're on Facebook, you can put it in the comment section. And I will read out as many as I can to our panelists later on. So with that, I'm going to hand to Andreas.
Thank you so much, Henry. And I'm really glad to share this report with you today and to have also my colleague, Francesca Gottschalk, with me, who's really the mastermind of this work and who thought about the issues we're going to talk about today long before they became so timely and prevalent. And it's about the kind of policy responses. Now we can look at those responses both from the kind of supply side, what we can do to create a safer digital world, but also the demand side, how we can equip young people to deal and navigate the ambiguities the cyber world involves more competently and strategically. So let me just share my screen with you to show you the results. Now, technology has brought such amazing opportunities to young people to connect, to collaborate with anyone. I don't think any generation before had the opportunities. But as always, every opportunity throws its own shadows, and we need to look at them as well. Basically, cyberbullying is just one of them. Bullying is nothing new for children, clearly, but in the past, you were quite safe when you left school. Now, cyberbullying follows you 24/7 or can do so. There are, in fact, several dimensions to cyberbullying that we should, look under different risk categories. There's obviously content. When children are exposed to cyberbullying, potentially as a bystander. There is conduct when the child engages in cyberbullying. There is contract. Many children are now very active participants in digital markets. You can actually make purchasing decisions as a young person today that you couldn't dream of in my generation. And there is contact when the child becomes a victim of cyberbullying. We need to look at them quite separately. They're very different dimensions. There are also quite different ways to define cyberbullying. But a quite common definition is willful and repeated harm inflicted through computers, cell phones, and other electronic devices. And we're using that definition in following. With the rise of technology, cyberbullying has clearly emerged as a major challenge that is a clear threat to the well-being of children, to the education of children anywhere around the world. And in a way, you can say no longer are bullies just present in the schoolyard. They can follow you anytime, anywhere, and target people in very new and different ways. So let's look at the differences between traditional bullying here on the left side and cyberbullying on the right side. The aggressive acts, you can say traditional bullying is more physical. Now that's the dimension that perhaps cyberbullying does not involve. But when you look at repetition, you can see, you just share and forward messages, content, and that actually, makes this permanent, even though you don't engage in the repeated act. I think that's a kind of real difference. The way technology can scale any content, it can scale the bullying act as well. When you look at power imbalance, that's obviously always the issue in bullying. What the cyber aspect adds here is the anonymity. Basically, you can do that undetected often, and therefore, so again, that creates a huge sort of imbalance here. And then the space, it's no fixed boundaries, anytime, anywhere. And I think those things make cyberbullying just a lot more prevalent than you might think in different ways. We collected data from 24 countries on this in our 21st Century Children Policy Questionnaire. That's a kind of instrument where we look at many aspects of childhood, but one of them was cyberbullying. And so we looked at the kind of risks and challenges which were most pressing in the view of the countries that responded to the questionnaire. Again, you can see the responses from 24 countries among the OECD countries, and you can see cyberbullying was the highest priority digital risk that countries identified. And the light blue bar tells us when this is a pressing challenge, and you can see also that is by far the longest. And then come issues around, security and privacy, harmful content, other things that are also obviously on the mind of people. But you can see very clearly the perception, what we're talking about here is the kind of perception and policy level is that cyberbullying really ranks first and foremost. It's something that we don't have yet a good handle on. In the academic research, reported prevalence rates vary quite a bit depending on how those data were collected. And there's also been quite a bit of heterogeneity across the individual studies. There was an international meta-analysis of 131 studies of cyberbullying among youth that uncovered prevalence rates of victimization that range from 10 to 40%. Then you have a more recent review that looked at victimization prevalence to be about 14 to 58%, perpetration ranging from 6 to 46%, and the most recent HBSC survey tells us that over 1 in 10 adolescents surveyed reported being cyberbullied at least once in the past couple of months. So that's 2-3 in a classroom. However, there was also here large variation in prevalence across countries and regions that ranges from 3% of 15-year-olds in Spain to 29% of 15-year-olds in Latvia. Boys in both cases. So again, you can see a lot of heterogeneity in this, and that makes it so interesting for study. Why do those rates vary? What are systems doing differently? And I think that's something that makes this a quite, if you would see the same picture everywhere, you'd ask yourself, that's a kind of phenomenon we probably can very little do about. But the fact that there is a lot of heterogeneity, by the way, also changes over time, suggests there are answers to those questions. Different from what you might believe, you can see that cyberbullying does not occur more frequently than the more traditional in-person bullying. The possibilities have expanded, but when you look here, basically the bars are not disproportionately different here. Approximately 7% of 15-year-old respondents told us that they had been a victim of cyberbullying a few times or a month or more during the past 12 to 12 months in our survey of the social emotional skills of young people that we conducted in 11 regions. Let me also highlight, you can see that here very nicely, that in the same survey, we did not see gender gaps. We did not see big socioeconomic disparities or gaps between students with a migrant background and those without. That's really interesting, that actually this is a phenomenon that transcends those kinds of traditional boundaries when it comes to education. It really is something that you can, that can hit anyone at any time. So, but also that, the exposure rates are actually also quite similar to the traditional bullying. There was some variation across sites. Remember, I said that in this survey, we covered large urban areas. You can see them here, drilled down by area, and you can see the variation. In some sites, such as Daegu in Korea or Suzhou in China, rates of cyberbullying were as low as 2%. And then you can see 7% in sites such as Ottawa and Houston. Again, you may say, well, 7% still looks like a small percentage, but that's a couple of students in every classroom. And think what this impact is over the life course of those students. I think that's something that we need to bear in mind, that these are things that are not just isolated instances, but they leave a trace. And so suddenly you can see those numbers, these relatively small percentages, in a new light. And that brings me basically to what research identifies as outcomes that are associated with cyberbullying. Now, when you look at cyberbullying victims, those are the ones who bully others or who are bullied themselves. Now you can see some of the outcomes here. When you look at the bullies, that's actually interesting, that evidence and research is a lot scarcer there. We know a lot more about the victims than about the perpetrators, but we do know that it's often associated with adverse mental health outcomes, including conduct problems, and also that the results are quite, heterogeneous. When you look at the victims, also there you can see, not surprisingly, mental health outcomes, adverse ones, and then potential symptoms of conditions such as depression, anxiety, and low subjective well-being. When you look at the protective factors, now that's also always the interesting part, who is more resilient. For those phenomena, you can see relationships matter a lot, whether it's parents, friends, teachers. Emotional intelligence matters a lot, self-efficacy. What are the beliefs of myself to overcome difficulties? And then, not surprisingly, digital literacy. Can you block cyberbullies? Can you deal the kind of messages or posts and so on? So that tells you already something of what we can do. But what I should say, perhaps as a caveat here, that these are all associations. We do not know the causal nature of that relationship. And some longitudinal work suggests that being cyberbullied might be causal of certain mental health outcomes, but some mental health conditions can also be predictive of a cyberbullying. You can see that relationship really working out in both ways in different contexts. But of course, again, the most interesting aspect relates to how do we respond to cyberbullying. And, one response, obviously, is how we can better protect young people. What can we do through technologies, through relationships, through our education institutions, and so on. But the other part of the equation is what we can do to strengthen that resilience, those digital skills that allow people to better respond to those challenges. And when you look at this data from PISA, if you don't feel you're ready for the digital world, your children are. Even before the pandemic, these are data from 2018. 15-year-olds spent an average of 35 hours per week on the internet. And in Denmark and Sweden, it was close to 50 hours. And actually, a large chunk of this is in school. You see that here marked in yellow. So once again, for young people, the digital world is the real world, and therefore cyberbullying has become part of the real world. Now, being born into the digital world doesn't mean that, children are digital natives. I think that's often a mistake that we make, that you can operate your mobile phone doesn't mean that you can distinguish fact from opinion, that you can suppress, harmful content and things like this. And actually, the data are quite stunning. We have interesting results from PISA where we looked at, the digital navigation skills, to what extent can young people intentionally navigate the internet, again, distinguish fact from opinion, navigate ambiguity, build kind of walk through complex contexts and so on. You can see, there are a few countries on the left side which are sort of quite a bit better on this. You look to Singapore, Korea, parts of China, but in the majority of countries, actually, most young people have still quite limited navigation skills. An age 15 is an age where you can actually sign a contract on your mobile phone. I do think we just need to keep that in mind, that the capacity is actually still quite constrained, and that our education systems often, teach 19th century literacy, how to extract knowledge, but not 21st century literacy, how to construct and validate knowledge. I think that's something that we should just keep in mind. Education systems can take now a number of different approaches to tackle risks in a digital environment. There you can see here that the goals should reflect ways to manage the risks, not necessarily to avoid the risks. Now, that's also sort of the other danger that we shouldn't, fall into, sort of to prevent that young people have any exposure to technology, and therefore, when they get out of school, bear the full brunt of this. Now, schools need to have young people to manage those risks, to live with those risks. And actually, what research tells us here is that taking enabling approaches and finding ways to allow children to safely explore and navigate the digital environment is really what helps those digital skills and also the digital resilience that becomes so important. And quite in contrast, when you take very restrictive approaches that just limit exposure to digital risks, that also limits the opportunities for children to develop that resilience. So I think that's something really quite important for education systems to proactively engage with the digital world. When you look at responses to policy-based interventions, the Kiva program developed in Finland and NoTrap in Italy are examples, quite well-known examples, which actually tell us we can deal with this. There are actually policy programs, initiatives that are not time intensive. You look to Kiva, actually, these are a few sessions, and they're very impactful. They can change, they can move the needle on this. When you look at programs, policy initiatives that have proved to be successful, they often share sort of three common threads. First of all, they have robust policy and legal frameworks, and that includes action plans and frameworks that schools or school district can adopt. So there is a kind of common narrative around this that can be used to build. There's also legal responses to address cyberbullying through existing laws. What do you do with defamation, with harassment, with copyright, things like this? So that's the policy and legal aspect. The second is about reporting mechanisms, equally important. What do you provide in terms of helplines and hotlines? What kind of digital reporting mechanisms can provide support, can provide assistance, and how do you actually, institutionalize digital safety and also resource schools, teachers, and parents adequately. And last, you have those school-based interventions. Anti-bullying or anti-cyberbullying initiatives often focus on skill building, on promoting peer relationships. Now, once again, one of the important protective factors is the people who are around you and how you relate to them. A little bit on teacher training, but more about awareness raising. What can you actually do to actually recognize the incidence, intensity of cyberbullying, and then interventions also use digital approaches. And those three pillars are really very important to effective responses to cyberbullying. And first, teachers around OECD countries often still feel underprepared to deal with cyberbullying. Now, we surveyed that in our studies, and you can see that teachers are often key stakeholders in cyberbullying response and prevention. Basically, everything is centered on them. They are the primary contact point, often the most important person of trust of children. Sometimes more important than, the immediate social environment that can more be part of the problem. So teachers are important, not just in delivering and participating in school-based anti-cyberbullying interventions, but also, again, through fostering the digital skills and to promote the kind of social environment, classroom climate that prevents those things from happening. And as I said, teachers in many cases are also trusted adults who students come to when they need help. And so high quality teacher training is often being associated with more effective bullying interventions. I don't think we should, always look to teacher training. That's our kind of immediate response when there's an issue. How can we train teachers better? No, it is also a lot to do with the kind of environment in which teachers work. And there is a very clear need for teachers to be able to identify cyberbullying and then to implement effective responses to this. As you can see here, and as I said, these are data from our 2018 21st Century Children Policy Questionnaire. Very few systems require teachers to learn about digital risk to students. That's basically the shortest bar on this survey. People think about the physical health, the digital skills, the use of technology, but when it comes to assessing online risk to students, the bars get a lot shorter. So I think that's certainly something to think about. Very interesting, our results from the Teaching and Learning International Survey, TALIS, also shows that teachers report a high need for using digital tools for teaching and learning. And despite the fact that for most, actually that was included in the initial teacher training. I thought that's really interesting, that actually it seems that teacher training makes a lot of attempts to deal with this, but still you can see the need is often very significant. So maybe the training is not effective, maybe it's not enough, we can't tell, but there's clear sort of a gap between what is needed and what is currently happening. And then, very last point really is that education clearly cannot do this alone. To form strategic partnerships with the key actors outside of education is really important to tackle the challenges of modern childhood in schools. Easy to say, hard to do, because again, that means looking at the ecosystem in which schools are embedded much more broadly and looking more intentionally how to build those connections between what's happening inside school and what outside school. And it's easy to ask teachers to do more and more things, but actually sometimes they don't have the time, the capacity, or the expertise to look at all of the challenges that they face today. Here is again data from our 2018 21st Century Children Policy Questionnaire. And what you can see is that in many education systems, partnerships with parents and families are required or present in most schools. I think that's a really good outcome. You can see that here in basically 80% of the cases. So when targeting challenges like cyberbullying, that's really essential, as the majority of the time cyberbullying will occur, outside the school environment. That is the reality. So you have to sort of engage the home environment, parents in this. Now, working closely with parents, establishing open lines of communication between families and schools, all those are really important to combat cyberbullying. Cyberbullying policy should also incorporate a learning element for parents and caregivers. We talk about teacher training, but as you see, parents are a really important factor here. How do we equip parents with better knowledge about technologies they themselves may not be really very familiar with? And you see here at the lower end of the spectrum, in very few systems are partnerships established with digital experts. Now I've marked it here in red. Those are the people who really understand those things. Cybersecurity experts, you can think of programmers, coders, and that's probably a shortage that most schools feel. They have, people who have good meaning and prepared, but they may not have the expertise, and that's really something I think that we haven't really factored into this. So as you can see, all in all, cyberbullying is a serious issue. It clearly shows long shadows over the life of children where it occurs, and also on the really amazing opportunities that technologies provide for children. But I also think we can take from these results that it's an issue that we can address by navigating and managing the risks carefully. There are a number of really successful programs that show actually it doesn't take a lot of resources, and most importantly, it doesn't take a lot of student time to actually make a real difference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andreas. A lot of things to think about there. Already the chat is firing up. But we'll now turn to our panel, who have been waiting very patiently. And I first want to come to Samir. So, of course, Samir is from the Cyberbullying Research Center in the United States. And Samir, what I would like to ask is, when a phenomenon like cyberbullying emerges, because, of course, it being relatively new with how, new the internet relatively is, a lot of myths start to emerge about what cyberbullying is and its impacts. We hear things like cyberbullying is occurring at epidemic levels, or it can lead to suicide. What should we believe? What's the truth?
I think Andreas did a really good job of underscoring some of those truths. For example, it's not an epidemic. The numbers are definitely concerning, but they're not spiraling out of control. He also talks about how we see these correlative relationships, but not necessarily causative relationships, especially when it comes to suicide. And anyone who promotes that message that suicide is directly caused by cyberbullying is unfortunately causing harm, because then youth start to believe that this is an acceptable way to deal with their social and relational problems. It encourages a contagion or a copycat effect, and we would never want that. And then also he pointed out that traditional bullying or school-based bullying still occurs more often than cyberbullying. And without a doubt, there is an overlap. Many times there's drama that bubbles up during the school day, which of course is going to carry on in the evenings, on the weekends, during the winter breaks and the summer breaks. And also anything that bubbles up in an online game or in a comment thread with regard to a social media post, of course, that's going to carry on during the school day, because the aggressors tend to be peers known from school or the community. So another myth that I would want to bring up before I turn it back over to you just has to do with how we respond to this. I feel that many adults are focused in on content knowledge and knowledge acquisition. So, okay, we'll get up in our classrooms and we will teach the definition of cyberbullying, and we'll talk about these harms that stem from the behavior, but I'm pretty sure that doesn't really lead to change. What we want to see is the change in the attitudes. What we want to see is the change in the behaviors. And research is clear that if we're able to make this more relevant to them, for example, through discussions, through role-playing scenarios, where they develop an action plan about what to do if they see a peer being harassed, if they're the bystander, or what to do if they're the ones being targeted, then they won't freeze or get stuck or get paralyzed in the moment and not know what to do, and then internalize or externalize the harm.
What about the cyberbullies themselves? Are there any ways that we can deter young people from engaging in cyberbullying, and what kind of deterrence would work?
What we're seeing when it comes to our deterrence research, and I know many others on the call have done their own work, is that we might naturally think that laws and sanctions and maybe police and governmental actions is going to do a lot to deter youth, but unfortunately, according to the research, it doesn't. And the strongest deterrents are actually what the teachers and educators think about you as a child or a teen, and what your parents think about you and as a child or a teen. Children, teenagers, they don't want to disappoint those who look after them, whether it's at school or whether it's at home. So that's one thing that I would say. And then in terms of the aggressors, I feel that our youth aren't by and large sociopaths. They have good hearts, they have good consciences. It's just sometimes they get caught up in the moment, they act on emotion, they act on spontaneity, and they end up inflicting harm. Some of that harm, of course, is very severe, but I think a concerted effort towards building empathy is extremely important, but that's going to vary for every child. There's not some sort of one-stop shop solution for every child, because what will really tug at my heartstrings will be different than what tugs at your heartstrings. What I'm sensitive about will be different than what you're sensitive about. And so it requires what also Andreas said, relationships, using those relationships to build empathy.
So of course we have Lucy with us as well, who works on, developmental psychopathology. And at the OECD, we have a tendency to take a very cold approach. We look at data and we look at policy. But Lucy, can you explain a little bit how cyberbullying might actually affect children? What kind of outcomes can we expect for their lives and their well-being?
Absolutely, and thank you. And just to say, I agree wholeheartedly with your comments, Samir, about being careful about how we label kids and young people, and mostly they're fantastic. So the impacts of bullying, mostly we've looked at this from longitudinal correlational research for obvious reasons. We don't expose randomized children to experience bullying and check for causation. And from the more traditional face-to-face bullying research, and also for the cyberbullying research, there are robust concurrent associations with things like poor well-being, symptoms of depression, symptoms of anxiety. And in those studies, when you look longitudinally as well, you often see effects a few years later, even when you factor out pre-existing individual characteristics that may also be associated with whether or not you're bullied. You mentioned earlier, some young people, some flags, for example, low self-esteem, shyness, anxiety, maybe impulsivity, can also predict your likelihood of being involved in bullying, and also can predict later poor mental health. But even when you statistically adjust for those, we typically see quite robust associations. I agree that the data is often not at a point where we can be as confident with outcomes like suicide, but certainly being cyberbullied can have very detrimental effects for young people's mental health. I will say, when we've compared effects of cyberbullying on well-being with face-to-face bullying, what we see is, although it is still concerning, that actually the effects of face-to-face bullying had a stronger relationship with poor well-being in our sample, at least, which was quite a large sample in the UK, than cyberbullying. So I don't think we should immediately assume cyberbullying will be even worse for young people's mental health, but this is an important risk factor and we do need to take it seriously.
Andreas said at the beginning that Francesca is the mastermind behind the paper that we just looked at. So I want to ask you, Francesca, what do we know about who is more likely to bully or be bullied?
There's, I think this was mentioned a couple of times. There are a number of inconsistencies across the literature. But one of the most consistent things that we can associate with being cyberbullied is being traditionally bullied. I think Samir mentioned this, that being bullied in school can definitely lead to being bullied online, or there's an association there. Quite consistent with the results Andreas presented about the survey on social and emotional skills. In much of the literature, we do not see clear or consistent patterns in terms of socioeconomic status or gender patterns. We know that some groups might be more vulnerable to experiencing cyberbullying, such as students who identify as LGBTQI+, for example, or those with special educational needs. And having strong relationships, not only mitigate the effects of cyberbullying, but they can also be associated with experiencing less cyberbullying, for example. In terms of who is the bully, offline misbehavior and violence is associated with online misbehavior and online violence. So we know that children who exhibit things like conduct problems or who tend to be violent offline might be more likely to perpetrate cyberbullying as well. And there's also an association with social and emotional skills. Children with lower social and emotional skills might also be more likely to cyberbully others.
So if we move on to kind of what we can do about this, there are a lot of different cyberbullying interventions that exist, some that target social and emotional skills that you just mentioned, others that focus more on school climate. What would you say, and so actually I'm actually going to ask this to Lucy first, so sorry, Francesca. What are the elements of a successful intervention and what are the effective ways of piecing the different elements together? So Lucy, what do you think?
Thanks very much. So I guess the first point is there are effective interventions, and that's really wonderful. And some of the interventions that have been shown to be effective for reducing cyberbullying are ones that were actually originally designed to tackle traditional face-to-face bullying as well. So for example, Cuva has been mentioned as a whole school universal intervention that has talk components, lots of that kind of role play exercises as well, that helps children to understand their role in bullying. So whether they're not, even if they're not directly involved as either victimizing others or being bullied, we find bystander effects are really important. So often bullying takes place, people witness it, and they may feel unable or unwilling to offer support either to the victim in the moment or later on, or may not realize that they should. And I think that bystander effect is really important online. We know that we have bystanders, and people often witness messages. And what effective interventions need to do is to make it very easy and very clear the ways that you can support a young person who may be being bullied, to support them directly, and also to report the incident. And I think, so there are universal interventions are great for overall prevalence. Targeted interventions are good for those young people who may have suffered harm as a consequence of bullying. And I think they probably do need to be embedded alongside each other. They aren't always, and that's a real shame, because what we're seeing is whole school interventions can be really good at reducing overall prevalence rates, but those more vulnerable youth may continue to show difficulties. The other thing I just wanted to highlight, although our interventions are often focused in a particular area, we shouldn't forget that, bullying occurs in a context. So there is a role for schools, and a lot of the interventions have been developed for schools, but families play a really important role. We need to support families and educate families about, what might help and what doesn't help. Telling your young child or teen to get off the phone and not to go online is not particularly helpful, but making sure that you build communication and trust with them so that they can come to you when they're experiencing difficulties is, for example. And of course, the platforms themselves have a role to play, both in terms of identifying bullying, and some like Facebook are using AI and different methodologies to try to identify bullying, but are also recognizing the need to have really good reporting systems, because the best artificial intelligence in the world won't always pick up things like exclusion or name calling that's more subtle and won't necessarily be picked up. So platforms also play an important role.
Andreas, obviously you have a position of being able to have seen different policy interventions in many different countries. Have you seen anything that could be replicated in one country that would work elsewhere?
Yeah, we actually survey bullying in general in our PISA surveys, and we do see countries where there has been real change. The example of Cuba was cited. There's actually some regions in Spain that used to be among the worst and actually have got moved to the best in terms of, and they have, whole of school approaches, the no tolerance policy, the consistent awareness, the kind of investment in relationships. And I want to actually reinforce a point that Samir made earlier on. You might think 15-year-olds, the last people they want to talk to are the teachers and the parents. Actually, the quality of the relationship between 15-year-olds and both teachers and parents was the biggest predictor for life satisfaction. You think, this is about your friends, your kind of environment. No, actually, school has a very significant role to play in building that relationship. When we looked at social emotional skills, we talked about resilience. How do you build that kind of cognitive social emotional resilience of young people? The quality of student-teacher relationships, again, the biggest predictor of that. And I think we forget that. We have made education too often a kind of transactional business and forget the kind of relational experience that is behind that. And I think, again, where you see systems making those investments, you see rates of bullying a lot lower. So you can actually, and I find this really interesting from an internationally comparative perspective, that the heterogeneity that we do see actually is one that is a big part of it is at the system level. I know there may be, cultural patterns behind it, differences in student response patterns, but I do think there are clearly systemic patterns that suggest, is worth looking from experience. Unfortunately, we do not have as much trend data as we would really need to better track those kinds of issues. Lucy mentioned longitudinal data. They're really quite rare also because the phenomena, the exposure really changes in nature. So I think there are a lot of issues involved, but I think for me, these findings make me optimistic that this is not a kind of intractable issue. In a way, we have gone through this on so many fronts in society. We invented cars, and it took us, half a generation to invent a seatbelt. In a way, I think we've got to build the kind of environment that makes the digital world a safe one.
I want to bring it back to Samir for your views on intervention. We talked earlier about deterrence, but what else do you think could work?
Well, I want to echo what Lucy has shared about the role of all of these different stakeholders. And I'd like all of us to continue to try to pound the table for those sorts of cooperative efforts to take place. And I also want to say, with regard to Francesca's report and everyone else who might have worked on it indirectly or directly, this is something that everyone in attendance should download and have on their machine, have on their computer so that they can cite it. One thing that comes to mind, and Lucy's done work in this area, has to do with resilience. I know that Andreas mentioned this as well, but we studied digital resilience a little while ago, and we asked a number of students across the United States, a national sample, a few questions. For example, when someone says something hurtful to you online, can you easily laugh it off? Are you easily frustrated when communicating with people online? Do you find yourself quickly responding to texts or emails or social media posts that make you upset? And when you have a bad experience online, does it stick with you for a long time? So all of those point towards digital resilience, which has to do with, positive attitudes and actions in the face of online adversity. And what we found very clearly in our research was that students with low levels of digital resilience, when they were cyberbullied, and let's say, for example, some will be, many will be, well, those youth, unfortunately, they were deeply hurt, bothered, and emotionally strained by that harm. Whereas on the other side, those with levels of high resilience, when it happened, they were able to shrug it off. And I would say in closing here that some cyberbullying is severe, but much of it is minor. Much of it is mild, name calling, insults, and exclusion. It could be mild as well for the most part. Our youth are going to be exposed to that sort of mistreatment as they move into adulthood, whether it's from coworkers, whether it's from cranky neighbors. It's bound to happen. And so I think right now, when they're in the safe and supportive environment of our schools and our homes, we should be teaching them a set of tools in order to deal with those conflicts. Otherwise, we are ill preparing them for adulthood. And that's where resilience comes in, both offline and online.
If I can just jump in and sort of reiterate something that you said, Samir, I think it's really important in the context of cyberbullying to also discuss with children what they actually think cyberbullying is, because you alluded to a number of sort of online aggressions or things that we can experience. For example, I think it's Dana Boyd who published about drama a number of years ago. So a number of young people will say, oh, that's just drama. I wasn't cyberbullied. That was drama. And in a way that can be very empowering, because I think if we take a victim approach and we say, well, you've been cyberbullied, how do you want to proceed? Whereas a child might say, well, actually, this was just drama between some friends or among some friends. I think that the way in which we approach disagreements or conflict in the digital environment needs to really take the child's interests and also the child's opinions in mind, because at the end of the day, we don't know exactly what's going on in the digital environment, and they are the ones who are experiencing it. So I think that that's a really important point also to keep in mind, that when we conceptualize cyberbullying, we need to think also about the kinds of conflicts children are experiencing and how they themselves would define those or not.
I have one question for Lucy before we then go to the audience questions, because there's a lot of great audience questions. But Lucy, I wondered if you have any advice for parents or caregivers on how they can best support or protect children from cyberbullying.
Thanks. I think the best way is to make sure you have those clear paths of communication and that you build on that relationship so that you have the trust there already for the young person to communicate with them. I think being able to listen non-judgmentally is really important. It's really hard not to jump in and say, but why didn't you do this? And at the heart of bullying is often a power differential, and something can seem insignificant to an adult, but is very significant to a young person. And asking why they didn't do something can often make it really hard. But helping to brainstorm with the young person about what they might feel comfortable doing could be really important. So rather than, offering that kind of, telling them what to do, hearing from them what they think would work, and make sure you check in and you check that they're okay and ask if they're okay. So if you notice your young person, is not eating as much, as looking down, is taking to their room more, is sleeping more, is going online in the middle of the night, making sure that you're checking in and having those conversations. And I wholeheartedly agree. Teenagers need their parents just as much as children do, if not more.
If I could quickly follow up, I love what Lucy has just shared. And what comes to mind is one of the things that I mentioned when I give talks to parents has to do with them building a no judgment zone in the house. Because again, youth are surveying the landscape, and as Andreas alluded to, they're looking for an adult that they can trust, who will not be judgmental or convey blame in any way, not just with words, but even with body language. A child will pick up on that so quickly and then shut down. And so even if you have to have a sign on your wall, a visible reminder that this is a no judgment zone, as a caretaker, as a guardian, as a parent, I think that could work wonders for the communication that Lucy emphasized as so important.
So we do have a lot of great questions in the chat, so let me turn to those. I think this first one will be for you, Andreas. Jun asks, to be a cyberbully would require good digital skills, or no, to combat cyberbullying would require good digital skills. So the question is then, how can teachers and schools continue to help children develop good digital skills on their own, but at the same time deter them from cyberbullying? Might it be achievable through digital skills curriculum or some other way in the school system?
Well, I guess you need the skills both as the bully and as the victim. But I do think that investment in those skills is absolutely key. I think that's what builds the resilience, the confidence that actually this is something that I can address, that I feel that empowerment. So I do think we need to build better skills, also help young people better navigate the ambiguity that comes with all information flows. And we're not doing very well on this. We have built our education for a world of certainties. Now you basically trust information that you receive. You don't question it. And I think that is a transition that education still has to go through to create that digital literacy, not in the sense of technological competence. That's a real minor issue, but in the sense of being able to access, manage, process, reflect on information, build my own stance. And, that I think is something that we have badly neglected. The one chart I showed you is quite startling, that you actually talk about a majority of 15-year-olds who are not equipped for the world in which they live in today. And with artificial intelligence just on the horizon, these things are going to become a lot more prevalent. I think if you do not understand the nature of an algorithm, you're going to be soon the victim of that algorithm.
Definitely. There are actually a number of questions asking the same thing, which Lucy touched on earlier. It's about the technology companies themselves and what their responsibility is to combat cyberbullying. And a second part of that question would be about what kind of pressure governments should put on the companies. So I wonder if Lucy, you might be willing to elaborate on that, and then maybe anyone else might want to jump in afterwards.
Okay, well, I guess one of the issues is accountability, and face-to-face bullying, for rightly or wrongly, it's often seen as the school's responsibility. I would say it isn't just the school's responsibility, but it's seen as that. Cyberbullying is tricky. So when different organizations have tried polling whose responsibility is it, and you see that people have a range of different views. Many people support that the platform, the particular platform on which cyberbullying is occurring has a very important role to play, but others will say it's the parent, it's the young person, it's the school, because oftentimes these are kids that know each other. So perhaps it's still the school. And that kind of divergence and accountability can be problematic in terms of deciding who's going to drive this forward. But that being said, I think everyone agrees that all of these stakeholders play an important part, and certainly some of the biggest online sort of software organizations, I mentioned Facebook earlier, are very aware of this problem. They're funding research into bullying. They're thinking about their own platforms and how they can start to investigate bullying on their platform. They're finding it tricky, as I mentioned, so because sometimes bullying isn't as obvious as we might think. And they're trying to create things like dislike buttons, trying to get information taken down, making it very clear how information can be taken down, making it very easy for people to signpost and report instances of bullying that are then investigated. So building that infrastructure. Unfortunately, I can't really speak to the policies. I would love to hear more about this. about how we can kind of enforce this from different companies. I know there is a lot of work in this area, but unfortunately, I don't know enough about it.
Well, I wonder if Samir, maybe not on the policies, but just in general, what your views on the responsibility of the companies is.
Sure, I largely agree with Lucy. I think that there should be more done when it comes to obviously technologies, feature sets, et cetera. But I also think that sometimes it's very easy to scapegoat these companies and just assume that they're not doing anything or they're clueless and they're just completely interested in profit making. Whether or not that is the case, what I would say is they have built safety centers. They have built in-app features and controls. Have you taken the time to sit down with your teen and make sure that they know how to block, mute, report? Have you watched some of the how-to videos so you can control their online experience or tether their account to your account so you can get certain notifications or updates? And so I think that as more and more of these technologies come down the pike from the companies, it's incumbent upon us as adults, youth-serving adults or parents or guardians to take advantage of those features, those controls, those settings to help keep our youth safe.
Andreas, in the chat, we have a question from Anna that I wanted to put to you. Do you think that teaching social and emotional skills in schools can help to prevent cyberbullying?
Yeah, maybe still on the previous question. I do believe in regulation, and I think that is important, that there is a strong regulatory environment in which companies operate. But at the same time, for knowledge products, that's a very, very tricky business. It is something that, we will always run behind what is technologically possible. The only way to combat this in the long run is to look at the enabling side, the digital skill side. I think really we need to get ahead of the curve rather than running behind it in, regulating. But on the point of social emotional skills, absolutely. I mean, we all talk about the importance of relationships, and relationships can be learned and taught. They're not, empathy is not a personality trait. It's actually a skill, certainly for young children. And I think investing in those relationships, investing in the social emotional skills is a very powerful way to create a stronger net in which young people can sort of see themselves embedded in knowing who to turn to. So I do think that is a very much neglected policy response to those phenomena. We know a lot less about social emotional skills and how they can be nurtured and developed than we know about, cognitive skills like math and science. And I think it's time in the 21st century where those skills are becoming a big differentiator, not just because of cyberbullying. We probably should pay a lot more attention to that.
I'd like to just add a point here, not 100% based on social and emotional skills, but thinking of ways in which we can support children in instances in which they're being cyberbullied, or as I see Susanna mentioned, what can be done to stop cyberbullies. And a number of governments are actually working on digital citizenship education programs. So thinking about ways in which students can actively engage in the digital environment while leaving a positive trail behind them. So what are sort of the norms of engagement with others in the digital environment? How can you engage in online civic life? What can you do to basically be an ethical actor in the digital environment? And you can read about it in the 21st Century Children reports. We did our 2018 policy survey, as Andreas alluded to in his presentation, and we asked countries, in which ways are you tackling digital citizenship? How are you implementing digital citizenship education? And there are a number of really interesting examples. So I'd invite the listeners to look into those reports, because a number of countries around the OECD are implementing programs in this space. And not only does this help children in terms of developing their digital literacy, but it's also thinking about how can they be ethical actors in this space.
I think we have time for just one more question. And I think, Andreas, you might be best placed for this one. It's about school climate. So Katerina asks, what are the characteristics of the school climates that reduce and prevent both cyberbullying and traditional bullying? What kind of environments do the adults around need to create?
Well, I actually think that, Lucy and Samir will be well placed to talk about it. What I can say from our work on PISA is that the school climate is very much an outcome of school policies. You can see very significant variation across schools and even more across countries. I do think that is, probably one of the best levers that we have to create a safe and open climate where you have stable relationships, where you know who you can talk to. And it's, by the way, not just a good investment in the safety of children, it's also a very good investment in better learning outcomes. I do think the environment that we create is a huge predictor on the ways in which young people engage with learning and with many other things. And it is one of the things that I would say, cognitive activation strategies and so on, they really require a lot of teacher competence. I think school climate is something that is actually not rocket science. I think that is a matter how much attention you pay to this, how you intentionally you embed that into teaching policies and practices. And by the way, school policies, I think the classroom climate is very much a school factor, not just a classroom factor. So, but I think probably Lucy and Samir will have more to say on that.
Yeah, so maybe we can pass first to Lucy and then Samir, but I ask, we've only got 2 minutes left, so please keep it brief.
I think school climate is everything. Having a climate where there is a zero tolerance sort of attitude to bullying and harm, but also one in which people feel understood and supported. They know that they're listened to, but you foster those relationships both within the student body, between the students and the teachers, but also the teachers with themselves as well. We know that in schools where there are difficult relationships between teachers and the governing body, for example, you can see high rates of prevalence. So it really is working on building those relationships at all levels within a school to create a healthy climate. And I absolutely agree, this is important for bullying, it's important for young people's mental health and for their education outcomes.
And we want to connect students. We want them to feel like they belong, that they're invested in the community. And adults, we get together in a boardroom over coffee and we think of our own ideas, but how much more powerful would it be if we enlist the youth themselves to come up with peer-led initiatives? Their ideas will be much more relevant, will resonate much more strongly with the youth. And so we've got to tap them. We have to enlist their skills, their abilities, their talents to carry the torch, to send the message, to establish the norms on the campus, in the school environment. And so I would want all of you to be encouraged, emboldened, know that OECD, Oxford, our research center, we're all here to help you. We're all here to assist you.
Thanks, Samir, and thank you to Lucy, Andreas, and Francesca. I think we've run out of time now, unfortunately. I'm sure we could talk a lot longer about it, but we do only have the 1 hour slot. So thank you to all the panelists, and also, of course, thank you to our participants for your interest in this topic and on the OECD's work on education in general. Just a quick note, if you'd like to learn more about the paper, there was the link posted to it in the chat. I also believe my colleagues have put a link to where you can find the recording of this webinar as well, if you want to watch it back later. And also, if you would like to keep up to date with all of our work in general on education, I think the best place to go is our Twitter page, which is @OECD EduSkills. OECD has a kind of unique Twitter for education matters only. So there you'll find basically everything we're working on education. So I encourage you to go and have a look at that. So yeah, with that, I'll bring it to a close. Thanks again, everybody, and I hope to see you at the next webinar.